Yeah, you talk about a little bit, Nichiren, Reverend Nichiren. Please tell us a little bit more about the Reverend Nichiren. We want to know more about him and what was he doing?
Well, that's a really interesting question because you want to talk about one of the most colorful figures of Japanese history. Nichiren Shonin always seems to come up, either about himself or his followers or the tradition in which he inspired. That's really interesting. As you said, you see the Daimoku chanted in many movies and different places, etc. Now, asking that question about who was Nichiren Shonin, it's interesting because what an interesting character. Nichiren Shonin first, and this is one of the reasons I became a Nichiren Buddhist, is very important, besides just talking about his life, understanding what was the point of his life. And that entire point was one question. What was the Buddha's true teaching? What was the Buddha's true essence? He really wanted to know, because he didn't come from a long line of priests and aristocracy, which, as you know, at that time, you had to be part of some kind of aristocracy in order to practice Buddhism. It wasn't just you wanted to go to a Buddhist monastery and you decided to study that you could be admitted. It wasn't that easy. So Nichiren Shonin always said to the time he passed away, I was born to a fisherman. So Nichiren Shonin himself was born in 1222. And his father was a fisherman. However, they believe that he was probably a lower class samurai, because during that time in Nichiren Shonin's life, he was a very interesting child in which he had lots of questions. And it was fascinating how he wanted at a very young age to study Buddhism. So at a very young age, probably according to some custom, he was brought to a Buddhist temple, because most Buddhist temples were places of education. So the educated class would use temples to become educated in perhaps Buddhism, how to read, how to write, Confucianism, etc. And so Nichiren Shonin entered as a very young person, as a young man. And the interesting point with this one question that I said, what is the true meaning of Buddhism? He went beyond the small little temple of his area. He went to the major temples like Mount Hiei, and also to other traditions temples. So he actually studied most of the basic traditions at that time, including Tendai, Zen, Shingon, those kinds of teachings. He studied them. Because when people look at Buddhism now, they think of it as a secular, the Japanese Buddhism specifically is very secular. But at that time, it wasn't such that you could go anywhere to study. And as he developed himself with the sincerity, because Nichiren Shonin is always seen as the character of sincerity, because he kept this question throughout his life. And even when he became famous, he didn't lose that question. He kept practicing. And as he grew, he challenged the Buddhist institution itself. That's a really important part of Nichiren Shonin's character. That's why sometimes he's misunderstood as perhaps a loudmouth. Because when I met Nichiren Buddhists, they portrayed Nichiren Shonin as somebody who would just yell at other Buddhists and tell them that they were wrong and just a difficult person, right? But actually, when I studied, that is not the case at all. He was a very pure person who had a question. And it was interesting. Whereas many of the other traditions founders came from very high families, Nichiren Shonin said, I was the son of a fisherman, which is quite significant because fishermen were considered untouchables because they took life, which of course, in the guise of Japanese society, is seen as something perhaps negative. So therefore, kind of contamination because one kills animals, etc., for life and gives it to other people. So Nichiren Shonin always had this kind of organic nature to him. And he went and he studied all the different traditions. And then finally, he came to the conclusion that the Lotus Sutra, and he, for the first time, before his first how do you say, sermon to his teacher, because when you went to study at these great temples, you were expected to come back and share information with the congregation, especially the Lord. And Nichiren Shonin at that time chanted the Odaimoku for the first time, which he, well, they say for the first time, but where he proclaimed that that was going to be his soul, his platform in which he was going to teach, was showing that he only had faith in the Lotus Sutra. And so he gave a lecture in front of his teacher and in front of the Lord, in which the first thing he said, he criticized some of the other sects of Buddhism, especially the Nembutsu or Amida Buddhism, who prays to Amitabha Buddha, the Pure Land sect. Because during that time, and that's what he was sent to Mount Hiei, and he went around to say, what is the proper Buddhism to practice now? So he, of course, said that, and in that moment, his first sermon, not his second sermon or his third sermon, he was disowned by his teacher because he was speaking out against the Buddhist institution. And then he, within that lecture, was attempted to kill him by the local lord who wanted him executed. And he was able to, because back in the day, when you rocked the boat, it didn't mean you went to jail or that people didn't like you. You were being executed. So that was the first time Nichiren Shonin, an attempt was made on his life, and he escaped. And that wouldn't be the last. So one important part of Nichiren Shonin's, character is that constantly he would say what had to be said because of the kind of compassion that usually it would result in other Buddhists, which is kind of ironic, to try to kill him. Because you have to understand, Buddhists at that time, especially the Buddhist institution, was a government institution. So temples were not just places of practice or prayer, they were government-sponsored places of study and practice that were by certain lords, etc., and even government offices where you would register birth, death, etc. And so Nichiren Shonin then taught very severely in the streets. So he was a street preacher, which is really fascinating. But he was always up for debate. And it's people misunderstand, and that's where one of the dangers of having such a great founder is that people try to pretend they understand Nichiren Shonin. And I think in doing that, that causes a huge disservice to his memory and his teaching, because in most people's mind, they only think about the extremist of Nichiren Shonin, teaching and debating with other schools. And that shows how great and learned Nichiren Shonin was. But there was another side. Nichiren Shonin by far, and this is why out of many of the teachers that existed, there are so many letters, original letters of Nichiren Shonin that have been kept because they were so important and sacred. And they were written, a lot of them were written to lay people, which wasn't really the norm. And also, as I said before, to women in general. And that's a really important part, because a lot of, people don't understand the inequality of women at that time and the Buddhist institution. It's still, now we have the problem, but Nichiren Shonin supported and wrote many letters to support women, especially of all different backgrounds. And so there's this really warm, kind, almost, instead of that really hard, strong character, was tempered by this really emotional being who would cry with people. It's really fascinating, because usually the way we don't see such a human element to a lot of Buddhist teachers, because they show them as this enlightened being and that's what they are, and we don't know anything about their personal life, etc. But Nichiren Shonin is this really human example of somebody who is devout to answering a question and also compassionate. So with his severity was also this really, really gentle character. And that gentle character was one that even of those people that he criticized that were members of the other sect, he took care of them. And so that's why Nichiren Shonin is such a complex, interesting character.